You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
Apple. From a garage to one of the largest companies in world history. The question must be asked, how did all of this start, and just how big are Apple today? In this video, we'll take a look at the fascinating story of where Apple came from, and then some facts. We'll then move on to the company's size, and finally finish up with some conclusions. My name is Dagogo, and thanks for joining me. Please get comfortable. This story is a pretty good one. Let's begin. The beginning of Apple was a true all-American story. You know how they say great things happen when you're in the right place at the right time? This is true for the foundation of Apple. The year is 1969, and the timing was perfect for some real innovation. It was a moment when the largest generation in US history, the baby boomers, were becoming adults, 80 million strong. It was an explosive shock to the system. They were dissatisfied with their country. They didn't want their friends and classmates going to war.
Well, I don't want to go to Vietnam because I don't want to get killed.
They wouldn't stand for any sort of discrimination. There were new ideas about what the world could be. It was a young revolution separate from mainstream America, a counterculture. In tandem with this, the microchip was in development and would be another revolution just on the other side of the decade. The place was also ripe for innovation, as San Francisco was the epicenter of the counterculture movement. It would be during this mix of time and place in 1969 that a 14-year-old Steve Jobs would meet a 19-year-old Steve Wozniak. They were your run-of-the-mill students with a love for technology, pranks, and the Beatles. Neither of them had any idea that the two of them would soon change history. Steve Wozniak was always keen on computers.
And I took this book home that described the PDP-8 computer, and it was just like a Bible to me. I mean, all these things that for some reason I'd fallen in love with, like you might fall in love with playing a musical instrument. I fell in love with these little descriptions of computers on their inside. I could work out some problems on paper and solve it and see how it's done, and I could come up with my own solutions and feel good inside.
Wozniak shared a common dream among tech enthusiasts, the dream to own a personal computer, an impossible concept at the time. This all changed in 1974 with the introduction of the Altair 8800, a DIY microcomputer kit. Even though it didn't have any output apart from a set of flashing lights, it caused mass excitement and hysteria among tech enthusiasts. So much so that computer clubs began to pop up all around the US just to discuss all the cool things that you could do with an Altair 8800. One of such clubs was the Homebrew Computer Club in San Francisco. This club was different though. According to Jim Moran, founder of the West Coast Computer Fair, the general belief system of the Homebrew Computer Club was influenced by the counterculture happening around the area. For the club, this meant that helping each other and sharing everything was the norm. It was a team effort to figure out what the new Altair computer kit could do once it was put together. Meanwhile, Steve Wozniak was building his own computer. At this time, early CPUs from Intel and Motorola had just become publicly available, and Woz took advantage. Each week, Wozniak would bring his computer into the Homebrew Club with new improvements each time. He was too shy to put up his hand during the club session, so he would just set up his computer at the session's conclusion, but something would happen every time. People would start to crowd around and ask him questions. Steve Jobs, who also attended the club, noticed this and told Woz, "The two of us should really sell these things." So, starting in this garage in April of 1976, the two boys, with the help of some friends, got to work on the Apple I, a single circuit board with no included keyboard or monitor. This was officially the beginning of Apple Computer. The group of friends sold 50 Apple I's. To Steve, this was proof that people outside the club actually did want to own a PC.
It was very clear to me that while there were a bunch of hardware hobbyists that could assemble their own computers, or at least take our board and add the transformers for the power supply and the case and the keyboard, for every one of those, there were 1,000 people that couldn't do that but wanted to mess around with programming. And so my dream for the Apple II was to sell the first real packaged computer.
Steve's vision of a ready-made PC was actually impossible at the time. It would take way too many chips, making it too expensive and too complicated. It just couldn't be done without some serious innovation. As it turns out, Woz didn't actually know it wasn't possible. He single-handedly used his mind to make an industry breakthrough.
And then I got into a way of why have memory for your TV screen and memory for your computer, make them one. And that shrunk the chips down, and I shrunk the chips here. I looked through manuals and found a chip that did it in one chip instead of 5 and reduced that. And one thing after another happened. I wound up with so few chips. When I was done, I said, hey, a computer that you can program to generate colored patterns on a screen, or data or words or play games or anything. And it was just the computer I wanted.
Steve Jobs added his design knowledge while insisting that the computer should be easy to use. This combination made the Apple II palatable to the consumer. Steve Jobs managed to get some investment money together for manufacturing. The PC was now a far cry from the hobbyist box with a bunch of lights and switches just 2 years earlier. The new company showcased the Apple II at the 1978 Computer Fair, and they stole the show outright. No one had ever seen anything like it. After this, Apple was off, literally exponentially.
I was worth about over $1 million when I was 23, and over $10 million when I was 24, and over $100 million when I was 25. And it wasn't that important because I never did it for the money.
The future would not be all smooth sailing though. By 1980, IBM saw Apple's success in the PC market and realized that they were wrong about the PC. It wasn't just a hobbyist toy, it could actually be used to extend human intellect and even for communication. Throughout the 80s, Apple would battle with IBM and the other PC manufacturers, losing market share as they went along. For Apple, the next few decades would see failure, success, and everything in between. After losing its way and flirting with bankruptcy, the company would shed the excess and return to its roots, ushering in a second golden age. The modern era of Apple is a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. They have a strong devoted following and managed to take home 92% of all smartphone profits in the first quarter of 2015. With all of this in mind, let's look at 7 fun facts about the company before we take a look at how big they really are.
Number 7.
Where did the name come from? According to Steve Wozniak's 2006 book, I Was, Wozniak explains that the name came when he was driving Steve Jobs back from the airport. Jobs had just returned from a commune called the Apple Orchard. In the car, Jobs suggested the name Apple Computer. Wozniak was concerned about the name because they could have issues with the Beatles' Apple records. As it turns out, the pair just couldn't think of anything better, and Apple Computer stuck.
Number 6.
Apple actually had 3 co-founders. So we all know Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, but there was a third person that many people wouldn't have heard of. Ronald Wayne. He was the one who designed this original Apple logo, which featured Sir Isaac Newton. It was of course soon scrapped because it was too detailed. Wayne left the company just 12 days after it was founded, selling 10% of his share for just $800. If he'd stayed with his 10% share, it would be worth over $60 billion today. Wayne, who is now 80 years old, says he has no regrets. That really sucks, but I guess it happens.
Number 5.
Shortly after being shooed out of Apple in 1985, Jobs applied to fly on the space shuttle as a civilian astronaut and even considered starting a computer company in the Soviet Union.
Number 4.
It's fairly common knowledge that Jobs had the rare insight to see that technology had a strong emotional tie. But what most people don't know is that he actually dedicated an entire team devoted to packaging and studying the experience of opening a box.
Number 3.
According to a 2015 interview with Steve Wozniak, when they met, Steve Jobs had never designed anything as a hardware engineer and had never written any software. Jobs would obviously grow his skill set as the company matured.
Number 2.
The iPhone project was so secret that the hardware guys never saw the software, and the software guys never got to see the hardware. Hardly anyone inside Apple knew what the finished product would look like until Steve Jobs revealed it on the stage.
Number 1.
Steve Jobs actually served as a mentor for the Google founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page. Okay, so we've learned quite a bit so far, and we have some great context under our belt, but let's dive into the real stuff. Just how big is Apple? Apple's first quarter revenue in 2015, just from the iPhone, was $51.2 billion. That's greater than Yahoo's entire market cap at $45.5 billion. And that's 3 times more than Google's total revenue in the third quarter of 2014, or almost twice as much as Microsoft's quarterly revenue. Apple has more than $178 billion in cash. That's more than enough to buy IBM. In fact, Apple could buy Ford, General Motors, and Tesla and still have $41.3 billion left over. Or alternatively, Netflix, Tesla, Twitter, Dropbox, Pandora, and Spotify combined. The company has twice as much operating cash as the US Treasury. Apple's net income last quarter was $18 billion, the largest quarterly earnings for any company ever. The previous record was held by Gazprom, Russia's huge oil and gas company. They clocked in at $16.2 billion of profit in August of 2011. Apple is actually an anomaly. Every other company in the top 25 most profitable quarters of all time have been an energy company. So a few of you would be asking, how does Apple compare to Samsung Group? In terms of revenue, Samsung has generated almost 2 times as much as Apple and has 4 times the number of employees. But if we look at company net income, the story kind of switches. Samsung actually pockets less than half of what Apple does. This means that although Samsung has its hand in everything, Apple is a much more efficient business, only sticking to a handful of products and nailing their target market in the process. So let's take a look at the even bigger picture with all the huge companies in the world. First, let's look at revenue. In terms of revenue, Walmart is number 1, Samsung is number 10, and Apple is number 17. But again, if we look at net income and profits, Apple Incorporated is number 1. ExxonMobil trails Apple by almost $20 billion. Keep in mind that this was before the commodity price slide of 2015. This is simply amazing. So now let's begin to start wrapping up the video by discussing some interesting questions. What makes Apple so successful? A lot of Apple's success can be attributed to taking a different, more human approach to technology. Technology's job is not just to be a tool in life, but to get out of the way and be transparent, almost natural. Apple has historically done this extremely well. Answering the question from another angle, the modern era of Apple has actually had a lot to do with problem solving. What do I mean? Well, since the late 90s and early 2000s, we entered the true digital age. Core technologies such as RAM and CPUs had falling prices, but storage size and speed capabilities were skyrocketing. This meant that there was a huge explosion of new possible product capabilities. But there was a problem. How do you harness these capabilities to make great products that people want? The answer? Make them easy to use. Case 1. The iPod in 2001. Hard drive storage had come down to a reasonable size and capacity was increasing.
But interestingly enough, in this whole new digital music revolution, there is no market leader. They haven't found the recipe. No one has really found the recipe yet for digital music.
But Apple had a problem. If they were to make a digital player, there would be just too many songs to get through. Who would want to click through 1,000 songs one by one? How would we make this as user-friendly as possible? A haptic feedback scroll wheel ended up being the perfect solution. Case 2. The iPhone in 2007. Phones were now entering a new age. They were turning into mini PCs. In fact, if the iPhone was made in 1991 to have the same performance as it did in 2007, it would cost you more than $3 million. The RAM alone would cost $1.4 million. With the start of this new mobile age, the old thinking of a crammed keyboard with a tiny mouse or equivalent navigation had to change. There needed to be a better way. The solution? A capacitive touchscreen, the first ever to be put in a consumer device, a real breakthrough at that point. But that wasn't enough though. When you make all the details count, the product can sell itself. Remember, the simple list scrolling of the iPhone blew people's minds, not because it was Apple, but because people were amazed to see that technology could act so organically. It sounds simple today, but back then it blew people away.
Well, how do I scroll through my list of artists? How do I do this? I just take my finger and I scroll. That's it.
Uniqueness and innovation was key to Apple's early success. It was also Steve Jobs' belief in the emotional aspect of a technology product that set Apple apart, an aspect which many tech companies today still don't fully realize the significance of. So what's the takeaway, the big picture? I just love this story. A couple of kids tinkering in their garage created a company that now has a bigger quarterly profit than all the big oil companies and even Walmart. It happened because they're in the right place at the right time, but also because they were passionate about what they did.
The most important thing, though, I think, is that if you're going to start something new, you have to feel passionate about it, because it's really hard. Most of the difference between people that succeed and people that don't is the people that don't give up. They give up sooner than the people that succeed. And you have to be passionate about it because it's so difficult.
The roots of Apple at the Homebrew Computer Club also show us something. If you surround yourself with other passionate and positive people, it can lead to great things. It's just something cool to think about.